Let's talk about Virginia Held's paper, non-contractual society, a feminist view. Um, a lot of the most important political theory of the last couple of decades or several decades. Um, this paper was published in '87. Has emerged from feminist theory. And we're going to see two iterations of this. People who disagree with each other, I guess, or their views are contrast in interesting ways. Virginia Held and Martha Nussbaum. Um, Not that Nussbaum has to be conceived as primarily emerging from feminist theory. It's a very complex background to her views, which we'll be on to next week, I guess. Um, and we're sort of lurching from Marx into the contemporary world. One problem, obviously, with a survey course like this is comprehensiveness of coverage. We've had many centuries-long leaps, missing, amazing high points and things that would provide context for the things we are reading and so on. Now, I did post a handout on some of the contemporary or late 20th century, I guess, that's contemporary to me, debates about justice, which were dominant in Western political philosophy in the late 20th century. People like Rawls, Nozick, and communitarians such as Michael Sandel, for instance. Now, Dickinson offers a course on recent political thought, and that's where you would get a full dose of those theories. They do hover in the background in both. I mean, the Rawls and Nozick stuff was so dominant in the 80s and 90s. Rawls' version of classical liberalism. And that work does hover in the background for Held and certainly for Nussbaum. And I'll have to fill in a little bit of Rawls when we get to the Nussbaum. At any rate, Virginia Held gives a version of, or a political extension of what was called in the 70s and 80s care ethics. It's a certain version of feminist theory that often focuses specifically on the mother-child relation, or more broadly, family relations. And Held's purpose here is to contrast the contractually based political orientation of people like Hobbes and Locke. This tradition of creating a state through the rational decisions of self-interested contractors, which that orientation has versions being expressed as held rights, like Rawls, for instance, again. Like basically picturing society as a marketplace in which rational agents are trying to maximize their goods. And Held suggests, following the great Harvard psychologist Carol Gilligan, that we might reconceive the political relations in terms other than individualism and self-interest. Okay, like this picture of an economic agent as the basic political subject. All right. This is an example of what's known as second wave feminism. There are at least 3 waves of feminism. You can look that up if you like. But one thing to be certain about is that there is no official feminist doctrine on these matters, and if feminists disagree about all sorts of political issues, and have developed many interesting models for understanding politics. Some of them in contrast with each other, some of them developments out of one another. But you know, you do well not to think about feminism as a kind of set of dogmas or things on which everyone has to agree, although, you know, there's a bottom line on which you probably have to agree to count as a feminist, and that is the equality of women in various respects. All right. So the purpose is a direct contrast with the material that we've seen in Locke and Hobbes, and maybe the idea that this is kind of a male-oriented and socially contingent development in political theory, social contract theory, and that we could rethink, you know, myriad aspects of political relations if we thought in terms of the mother-child relation. Now, you know, romanticizing the mother-child relationship probably comes at a certain moment in the development of feminist theory. Maybe romanticized is a little too pejorative or whatever. Held is actually aware of this. You know, she wants to point out that there is a diversity of mother and child relationships. You know, she talks about the contingency of the way she's thinking about mothering to some extent. But really, she has a pretty, she thinks this is a paradigm of human life that really extends, I think, across cultures and maybe across historical periods. And again, not every feminist is going to conceive it that way. There are feminists who are going to start with like an attack on the mother-child relationship in the sense that, you know, the relegation of women to childcare or the association of women with childcare has been one factor of oppression and so on. All right, so let's take a look at some of the moves that Held makes. She starts out this way: political philosophy, the essential readings, the essential texts, edited by Stephen Kahn. Contemporary society is in the grips, 1980s, is in the grips of contractual thinking. Realities are interpreted in contractual terms, and goals are formulated in terms of rational contracts. It's a marketplace model of human relations. And you might recall quite similar attacks in Marx on what we might call classical liberalism. The leading current conceptions of rationality began with assumptions that human beings are independent, self-interested, or mutually disinterested. That is, I do not care about your good. I care about my own good. Mutually disinterested individuals, they then typically argue that it is often rational for human beings to enter into contractual relationships with one another. That's exactly what Hobbes and Locke do argue, particularly clearly in Hobbes. The only thing that drives us to associate socially at all and come into political relations is the pursuit of our rational self-interest, which is endangered massively in a state of nature. One thing that Held does is she, almost as an aside, is she attacks implicitly Hobbes's notion of the state of nature. She points out, okay, one thing that's definitely going on in a state of nature, a pre-political condition, is mothers are raising children. Or else there couldn't be any people, right? There wouldn't be any successful adults, right? So even in the state of nature, the fundamental relationship, or a very fundamental or universal human relationship virtually, has to do with care, at least to some minimal degree, not competition or rational pursuit of self-interest, right? I mean, one thing she just says straight out is that the mother-child relationship shows that egoism is false, that psychological egoism, which we've discussed, is false, a la Hobbes. All right, so the mother-child relationship shows that not all human action is self-interested. Some of it is genuinely concerned with the interests of people other than oneself. I mean, I think that's plausible. I think it's probably plausible on other grounds. But the mother-child or the parent-child relationship often shows this aspect quite clearly. Okay. So this is how she describes the project of her paper. I will try to imagine what society would look like for both descriptive and prescriptive purposes if we replaced the paradigm of economic man and substituted for it the paradigm of mother and child. What political results might, eventuate if we conceived human nature from the point of view of the mother-child relationship and not from the point of view of the competitive marketplace situation, which she, like Marx, thinks is a historically contingent style of human relationships which emerges at a certain moment, all right, like with the rise of capitalism. I think they probably agree on that, held in Marx, which pictures all of us as competitive individuals competing with all the other individuals for the resources, a scarce set of resources or whatever, right? Hobbes, for example, will picture that as the universal condition of mankind, humankind. But Marx and Held, think actually that's political ideology. Okay. And of course she talks about the centrality of motherhood to human culture, which is completely absent from Hobbes and Locke, for example. She says this, human mothering shapes language and culture and forms human social personhood. Again, this sounds awful essentialistic, like you have to be a mother, or maybe even a certain kind of mother, a female person for one thing, maybe to have to be in this relationship. She keeps pulling back from that kind of essentialism, but she keeps reasserting it too. Human mothering develops morality. But think about how true this is, though. It is in many ways. Human mothering develops morality. It does not merely transmit techniques of survival. Impressive as the latter can be, they do not have built into them the aims of morality, like the mere attempt to survive, a la Hobbes, does not have any moral content at all. Human mothering teaches consideration for others based on moral concern. It does not merely follow and bring the child to follow instinctive tendency. Human mothering creates autonomous persons. It does not merely propagate a species. It can be fully as creative an activity as most other type of human activities. And here she's just kind of responding to the claim that mothering is a merely biological function, an animal, not a human function, which is part of the content of of misogyny, maybe. Right? This association of mothering and even femaleness in general with animality, right? Or embodiment, perhaps, complex matter. All right. Okay, and she quotes as a contrast to what she's going to say, the kind of picture she's going to draw, David Hume, a great Western philosopher whom we did not read. Hume has a brilliant, and it's in our book, has a brilliant critique of social contract theory, devastating actually, which is interesting because he's following pretty close on Locke in a lot of ways in his philosophy otherwise. Okay, anyway, here's a quote from page 1014 in the left-hand column. David Hume, whom some admire for having moral views more compatible with women's moral sense than most philosophers have had, that would take us too far afield, had the following to say about the passion of avarice. Avarice, or the desire for gain, is a universal passion which operates at all times and all places upon all persons. Avarice, greed, is a universal human quality that operates at all times on all persons. Surely, says Held, we can note that in the relation between mothering person and child, mothering person, so, I mean, one thing she's going to allow that, for example, a father could perform the functions we associate with a mothering, or another person, right, or a grandmother, or a person that's not related to someone at all. The mothering relationship has to do with the ethics of caring for someone and nurturing them and empowering them, not primarily the biological tie of having given birth to that person, right, and being genetically connected with them. And so, like, I mean, Held is just saying, like, okay, that's an assumption of a lot of philosophy, political philosophy. It's an assumption of a lot of economics that greed is universal. But if we started with this different model, we could show that it's not. And I mean, the essence of this critique is the critique of social contract theory and of liberal democracy, maybe, and of classical liberalism on the grounds of its individualism. Again, this does connect to Marx. And you recall, and you should look again perhaps at the remarks that Marx makes about individuals and individualism in the Communist Manifesto, where he associates it with classical liberalism, which he associates with bourgeois or capitalist ideology. So Held says, this is right at the bottom of page 1015, Western liberal democratic thought has been built on the concept of the individual, seen as a theoretically isolatable entity, like could be considered independently of all other individuals. This entity can assert interests, have rights, and enter into contractual relations with other entities. But this individual is not seen as related to other individuals in inextricable or intrinsic ways. All the relations that this person enters into are conceived as voluntary commitments. Well, the mother-child relationship is not a voluntary commitment, for example, on either behalf, often anyway. The difficulties of developing trust and cooperation and society itself on the sands of self-interested individuals pursuing their own gain are extreme. There she's saying that if you start with a picture of individuals as bundles of rights negotiating with one another agreements in pursuit of their rational self-interest, you'll never generate a plausible politics. Right? You'll never generate a enduring political system. You're building on sand. These people will fall apart into their own interests immediately as soon as it's in their interest to do so. Right? A real politics has to be based on richer, thicker human relationships, histories, right? Real commitments to one another's welfare, which are possible according to people like Held. This connects this feminist critique, interestingly, to another critique of classical liberalism, often thought of as conservative, that was arising at this time, namely communitarianism, which I wrote about a little bit in the handout that's posted. People like Michael Sandel, for instance. The other person I mentioned in there is Alistair McIntyre, who they attacked the idea of classical liberalism, particularly in Rawls's version, but what the hell it could be locked to, as completely unrealistic about what the basis of political unity is. The possibility of entering into a cooperative political situation with other people depends on an underground a massive shared culture underneath. So communitarians often even sort of hinted or talked about national identities as absolutely essential to creating a political unity. There's no national identities in Locke and Hobbes in a way, right? It's just rational contractors the world over, right? But really what makes a viable political system is an engagement with the thick history of a culture. And, but the critique of liberalism, it's not that Held is saying all of that, but the critique of liberalism is very similar. You can't build a society on merely contractual agreements between self-interested individuals. That's completely unrealistic, is the first thing they say. And second, if it could be done, it would not yield a viable political system. Again, it would yield a system that fell apart every time it was in people's interest to fall it apart. To fell it apart. All right. Okay, and then I guess the main body of the text of Held's paper is drawing specific contrasts, 6 of them, between the contractual model of individuals entering into political systems for their self-interested purposes, and the mother and child relationship as a model for political arrangements. And, I don't want to hit you with a big critique of this, but I think problems do emerge with this model. Certainly if you take it quite seriously. I mean, there are hints here and there that when she says the mother and child relationship, she's using that as a model of the ruler-ruled relationship. Well, it's not patriarchal. It's matriarchal. But I'm not sure I want to be Donald Trump's child either. So let me just say that, all right? I'm not sure I want him to nurture me and set me free. But anyway, okay, so if we move to the mother and child relationship as a kind of model for political relations, here's some of the ways we rethink some of the basic political issues. Like I say, there's 6 of them. They're in section 3 of Held's paper. So one thing is that the mother-child relationship, I said this a second ago, is not merely voluntary. It ought to be voluntary on the part of the mother, she says, because she's a feminist, all right, and she's pro-choice and stuff. But it's not fully voluntary on the part of the child. And really the ties with the mother, the obligation of the mother that undertaken by the mother is also probably not fully voluntary, at least not voluntary in every case. All right, well, I don't know. I don't know quite how to negotiate that. But the child is not the mother's child in virtue of having agreed to that. Not voluntarily has he chosen whom to nurse or whatever, okay? And, I mean, she's just saying, realistically, we don't enter voluntarily into political arrangements either. We are born into them. Aristotle would agree with that, right? We are naturally political. We're born into a political system necessarily because human beings can't live without it. So, I don't know, this is a return to some ancient ideas too, I think. Certainly is, in a number of ways. Okay, and the mother-child relationship, she says, and this is number 2, is permanent and irreplaceable. I mean, you can think about to what extent that's true. But, and she says, even if the relationship frays, it persists. And now you could think about, the cultural contingency, possibly, of this model of motherhood. Is this true, universally true of mothers? Does it need to be for Held to make her point? And even though you can get some kind of surrogate mothers or something, or, et cetera, or adoptions or foster parents and so on, maybe you only have one mom. I don't know. My two moms, though. I don't know. Held might write this rather differently if she was writing today. She'd consider even more carefully different sorts of family relationships. But I mean, you could think about this just like let's deploy another model and see if it seems more plausible and see if it seems more decent in some ways in the political results it gives. Let's focus on different kinds of human relationships rather than marketplace relationships and see what comes out politically. Some interesting things. Number 3 is that equality means something different than merely equal rights. So Held talks about, think about a household with aging parents, some adults, 1 or 2 adults, she says, and a bunch of children. They are all of equal value, or they ought to be. But they are not. They do. But that value is not best conceived of as equal rights. Okay, your toddler does not have equal rights with you, right? And maybe your mother who's suffering dementia does not either. But they have equal value as human beings. This is an interesting move to make. Again, it gets me a little worried that what's going to come right down here is like a political model in which actually you don't really have any rights. So suck it up. I don't know, or do what we tell you. But you have equal value. So I guess that would be comforting, I suppose. But these are all interesting empirical claims as well, like about how we are connected to one another in different contexts. Another thing is that, and this raises a point that really a fundamental point in political philosophy that we have not covered this semester, which is the distinction really that emerges in clear form in the 20th century between the concept of negative and positive liberty. So negative liberty is the right to be left alone. All right. It's that negative liberty is what you get when you conceive people as bundles of autonomous rights. Like each of us has a right to be left alone, and that's all we've got. Okay, and we have the obligation to leave others alone, and that's it. We have a sphere of negative liberty. Now, within that sphere of negative liberty, I might starve to death, right? I might starve to death without anyone violating my freedom of speech. So many thinkers have developed a sort of concept of positive liberty because I'm not free to do anything if I'm starving to death. My freedom to assemble or engage in religious worship is of, relatively minor importance at that point. Do people have a right to health care? Do people have a right to education? Do people have a right to enough nutrition to keep going? Things like this. Those are positive rights or positive liberties. Right? And Held says, you won't get very far in characterizing the mother-child relationship in terms of negative liberties, a right to be left alone. Now, that is important maybe when you're raising teenagers, although there are limits too, okay? Although that's very debatable what they are. How far should you go to invade the privacy of your teenage child, right? But the autonomy emerges. It increases as time goes on, and that's one of the purposes of mothering, is to make that autonomy possible. Right? But if we're going to talk about rights within a family or rights in a mother-child relationship, it's a right to be fed and stuff like this, a right to be nurtured or cared for. Those are positive rights. If they're probably not even best conceived of in terms of rights. But basically the picture of us as just leaving each other alone, and that's how all we have to do to satisfy our obligations to one another, which you do more or less get in Locke, for instance. That might be somewhat exaggerated. Is you'd have to rethink that if you were thinking politics through the mother-child relationship, as Held recommends. The relationship between dependency and independence would have to be reconceived, right? Or the relationship between identification, between individuation, separateness, and identification, merger with other people would have to be reconceived. A child is radically dependent on the mothering person, if they're fortunate enough to have such a person. But the purpose of the mother-child relationship is to empower the child, eventually to release the child into autonomy, right? Even while preserving the relationship throughout. So for one thing, like I think that deep in the background, there's like a welfare state thing here, okay? Like government could care for its people, nurture its people, even if it was also concerned maybe to create a situation in which they could exercise freedoms, positive and negative. And maybe government should be concerned with that as an ultimate goal, actually. But again, conceiving the citizen-ruler relationship as a child-mother relationship, it gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, but maybe it would, though, given who I am or what I am. Okay. I'm not sure that, and people have done this, if it was the father-child relationship, I wouldn't be any happier with it. So maybe that's how I'm defending myself from the charge of sexism here. But I think it's interesting, right? I'm not just condemning it. I'm raising some worries about it, but I think it's well worth thinking through with Held along these lines. With Held. And that's the last item, the sixth item in her laundry list of ways that this might cause us to reconceive politics, is that the purpose of mothering, she holds, is something like empowering the child, making the child able to take control of their own lives in a certain way. Like there is a place for autonomy in Held's construction, but it's an autonomy that emerges because of decent political relationships, not autonomy that is a universal natural condition of human beings, right? Autonomy has to be an achievement, and potentially it could be the autonomy of each of its citizens in a certain way, like their ability to pursue their own goals is a decent goal of a government. So in a way, it's quite a sketch. It stays at a sketch level. Like these are some of the factors that would, some of the ways we would reconceive politics if we took this whole different paradigm of the political relationship. And then, each of those things could be, and maybe has been, a chapter of a much longer book on these matters. And like I say, don't regard this as an official feminist doctrine or something like this, because there's no such thing. But it's a really interesting way to emerge both from the classical liberal tradition and then to take up maybe some Marxist-style critiques and move them into this feminist realm. Marxist-style critiques of classical liberalism, and even communitarian-style critiques of the picture of human beings as autonomous rights bearers, and the picture of political life as a kind of marketplace among self-interested individuals. All right. That's it for today. Quick one. I think there's a lot in there. It's worth thinking about. I'll put it in a discussion forum too. I got to get on there and look. Hope it's going well out there, wherever you may be.